Because of the numerous specimens we have of afarensis, more than 400, 90% of which come from Hadar, we could talk about details of anatomy for an entire course. But I want to talk about a few other aspects of anatomy, of the anatomy of A. afarensis that are interesting. There's a considerable amount of variation in size. You see here the ulnas, remember the ulna on the left, there's a small one, there's a big one, there's a big mandible, a small mandible, there are big canines, small canines, as you can see in the down here in the lower left-hand corner. And look at the distal end of the femora, or the bottom end of the thigh bone. There's a small one, like the one I found in 1973, and a much bigger one. Some people, whoops, advanced. Some people think that this represented two different species of humans at the Hadar site, two different kinds of Australopithecus, perhaps. We feel that this represents sexual dimorphism, that the small ones, like the Lucy mandible, are, I don't know why this does this, but small ones, like the Lucy mandible, are females. The large one, like AL444 from the male skull, is a male. That the large femur, down in the lower right-hand corner, is a male, and the smaller ones are females. So we think that this represents dimorphism between males and females. Now, the first family site, when that was found in 1975, I think resolved this controversy as to whether or not there were two species or variation in terms of sexual dimorphism in a single species. Because these mandibles, the little one at the top left and the big one at the lower left, are from the same stratum. And our interpretation would be that the top, smaller mandible represents a female, and the bigger one represents a male. And you can see how much deeper the male, it's much more robustly built. And if you look at them on the right side, and just look at the lengths of those tooth rows, I think what we're looking at are males in the big specimens and females in the small. It doesn't mean that every specimen we find can be put into male or female, because there is a bell curve. And the big males cluster one place, the small females cluster another, but there's some in the middle. You don't know whether they belong to males or females. Now, sexual dimorphism in afarensis is quite considerable. It's at a quite significant level. For example, comparing males and females were about 3.5 feet or a meter tall, like Lucy. Males are estimated to be 5 feet tall, or 1.5 meters in stature. Females weighed somewhere around 66 pounds, 30 kilos. Males weighed 45 to 68 kilos, or 100 to 150 pounds. And that level of dimorphism, as you can see, is reflected in the female orang mandible on the lower left and the male orang mandible on the lower right. It's almost at the orangutan level, which is considerable sexual dimorphism. And we wonder, what does that mean in terms of social behavior and so on? Does that mean that we were living in, that they were pair bonded, or does it mean that they were living in multi-male, multi-female groups, or were they even living in harem groups? We don't know exactly. So here's a reconstruction of what afarensis would have looked like. I think the brow ridges are a little too strongly expressed here, but it does give you a good idea of that ape-like character that they would have with those powerful, relatively long arms and relatively short legs. They undoubtedly lived in groups like 333 with mixed males, females, adults, and children, and they probably were in many ways quite similar to bands of chimpanzees, for example, that were bonded together. Now, further clues to afarensis have come very recently, again in 2000, when Dr. Zoresinai Alamsaged, Zorai is a curator of anthropology at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. He did his PhD at the University of Paris and his postdoctoral work at the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University. And in 2000, he and his team found this skull. And what I mean by a skull is a lower jaw, mandible, as well as the cranium. That's really what a skull is. This is a cranium, this is a mandible, together they are a skull. And you see this beautifully preserved specimen in the upper left-hand corner. The mandible is still in occlusion. It is a very delicately built creature. It's a baby, and it's about 3.3 million years in age. And Zerai is holding that specimen in the lower left-hand corner. So where was this found? It was found at a place known as Dikika, which is just across the river from Hadar. You see Hadar in the lower picture there in the north, and Dikika just south of that. And we had worked in that area in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, and recovered several hominin specimens from that area, so we knew the potential was great. But it was difficult for logistical reasons and others to work in that area, so Zerai, fortunately, a young Ethiopian scholar, received permission to do that and began to search systematically. So you can stand actually very close to where the baby was found and look across the river and see Hadar in the distance. We found a beautiful baby at 333, 3/4 of a cranium, as you see, and probably portions of another baby, including the mandible and pieces of the lower face. So it's interesting that we now have a collection of immature individuals, of young individuals that died around age 3 or 4. And that allows us to look at that information and kind of understand how a baby Alfarensis grew up into an adult. And that is something that is the core of research for Dr. Zerai. Now here he is at a microscope. It gives me an opportunity to tell you about the painstaking work that goes into understanding these things or cleaning these things before you can even work on them, that goes on in the lab. This baby died 3.3 million years ago. We think it was sort of a delta. It was almost mummified first, probably, because there's so much preserved in it. And it got covered in sand. And you can see the sand particles. Look at the orbits of that baby. You're looking into the eyes, are filled with sand. Well, all that has to be cleaned out. It has to be cleaned out grain by grain by grain under a microscope with intense light in a quiet lab over months and months and months of work so that you can get down to the bony anatomy and actually look at it. And it's taken an innumerable number of hours for Zerai and an assistant of his to clean this baby and reveal the anatomy. But this is what happens to a specimen after it's discovered. It's brought back to the lab. It's cleaned up. The matrix, as it's called, is taken off so you can see the anatomy. And ultimately, that lower jaw has to be separated from the face. And Zerai has also applied very interesting new imaging approaches, CAT scans that allow them to take millimeter slices, even less than millimeter slices, micron slices through the specimen to look inside the bones. And that's very important. Why is that very important? It has told us that this little baby called Salam, meaning peace, that Zerai's team found is a baby girl. How do we know it's a baby girl? It's a fascinating story because if you look in the upper right-hand corner, that is a virtual X-ray, a CAT scan of the inside of the upper and lower jaw. You see the baby teeth, which are erupted and wear, but up in the jaw, you see other teeth developing. Those are the adult permanent teeth. And there is a canine, there's an adult permanent canine in there developing. And you can measure that in virtual space. And you can look at the size of that and compare it to the whole range of variation of Afarensis canines. And it falls in the larger group of, in the smaller group of females. So this was probably a female Australopithecus afarensis baby. In addition to that, work has been done on the details of how the teeth grow, looking at the enamel layers that are laid down, probably around 3 years old when it died. So an enormous, enormous amount of information that came out of this Dikika baby, Salam, sometimes called Lucy's baby. You see various views of it in here, but you see what was preserved. Almost the entire thorax, all the ribs, most of the vertebral column, the backbone, no pelvis, but parts of both legs, and unfortunately just a fragment of an arm. But one other piece that was preserved was the shoulder blade. And that shoulder blade, interestingly, in terms of its anatomy, looks more like a gorilla than anything else, probably more ape-like. And the other thing that's so fascinating is that funny little thing that's labeled D in this illustration. That is the hyoid bone in here. Very important for speech. And it's the only, more muscles attached to that little bone than any other bone in the body. But this looks like an ape hyoid, as if this baby might have made sounds, sort of like an ape, and was not capable of language. But it tells us something interesting that we never knew about. So many things to discover, so many things yet to understand. Afarensis gives us this very rich understanding of what goes on or in this unique species. We know it was a very long-lived species for at least 1 million years. Fossils go back almost close to 4 million. It was highly sexually dimorphic, males much larger than females. It was geographically very successful. We find it in Tanzania, we find it in Kenya, we find it in Ethiopia, and I think probably also out in Chad. There's one mandible that looks like Afarensis. It has a distinct suite of primitive anatomy that defines it as a species distinct from all other species of Australopithecus. At Hadar, with 400,000 years of time represented and major portions of skeletons, it has become an incredibly important collection for comparison. It gives us the anatomical yardstick over time, over geography, by which to judge other hominin paleospecies. An extraordinary window into the past made possible by these numerous discoveries throughout Eastern Africa.